This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Yesterday, I did a video talking about players who the Browns, I think, are likely to extend, players and coaches. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk about players that I don't think the Browns are planning to extend past maybe the 2024 season. And we'll start this list with a really good player, Amari Cooper. Now, I think Amari Cooper is going to be on this team for the upcoming season. Where I start to wonder if the team has long-term plans for Amari Cooper is in 2025, 26, 27. It's obvious to me that this team has had a desire to get younger at wide receiver consistently, using their top 3 draft picks at the wide receiver position. And it's a trend that I don't expect to stop. This year, I expect them to go after more wide receivers in the draft. So that's evidence. Plan number 1 is that they have been drafting young players at this position. David Bell, Cedric Tillman. They're really trying to find somebody who can fill the ranks of that wide receiving core. And I don't know if it's necessarily targeted at Amari Cooper, but it is geared towards the future. And the reason I don't think they're going to be able to retain Amari Cooper isn't because I don't think the Browns will want to, but in order for the Browns to keep Amari Cooper, they're kind of in this awkward situation of where they have to pay Amari Cooper more than what he would get in the open market. And that's just not a real winnable situation for this team in free agency. Like, yeah, if you look at it on paper, and you take out emotion, you can say, well, the Browns cannot extend Amari Cooper, let him walk to free agency or cut him before his deal is done, before he's due for like a $30 million cap hit. Let him test the free agency market, not get what he wants, and then sign him. Sure, you could do that, but that's probably not likely, right? It's like when we had all these fantasies about re-signing Odell Beckham and re-signing Jarvis Landry after you cut them, because in order to get Amari Cooper down for a reasonable number, you kind of have to cut him. He's not going to take an extension that's going to lower his number over the years. He's not going to take an extension that's going to put him anywhere under 25 million. And he's a good player, but he's an older player, and he's not Tyreek Hill. So you're not going to pay him $25 to $30 million a year at wide receiver. So unless you're willing to overpay for him, it's very unlikely you get an extension done. The only way you get him around the number that you would want is if you let him go. But once you let a player go, usually they don't come back, right? Like, that's usually what happens, especially a player of Amari Cooper's status. It's not something that seems very likely. So the Browns are in that awkward spot. They're going to have to do something with his contract in 2025. I think they sit on it for this year. They just kind of let him play at his current number and live with it. But for 2025, 26, 27, I don't know if there's really a pathway for Amari Cooper to stay on the Cleveland Browns. So that's why he's one of my guys here that I don't think the Browns are going to be able to hang on to. The next player who I don't think is going to get extended is Jedrick Wills. This is kind of a perfect storm for the Cleveland Browns if they want to move on from Jedrick Wills. Now, it's unfortunate that you have a 5th-year option on a player that you don't really have plans to extend. Usually when you use that 5th-year option, it's for somebody that you hope to extend. Jedrick Wills is kind of in an awkward spot where he's a good enough left tackle to earn a 5th-year option, but he's not necessarily a good enough tackle to earn the extension that he would want, right? It's kind of like the Amari Cooper thing. You're not going to give him the money he wants. He's going to have to get whatever he wants from the open market. Once he hits the open market, he's probably not coming back. And I don't know if the Browns really want him back at elevated cap number, right? Because he's not proven to be that reliable of a player. He's not as bad as some people make him out to be, but he's just not what you want at that tackle position, especially when you have Deshaun Watson extending plays. Sometimes his lack of motor can really be a problem, right? And that circles to the draft. This draft is a draft where I really think you can get a left tackle that you might have to sit for a year or two, but you can get somebody who can start, play well. And that is a gold mine to me. I think a lot of people have their eyes set at wide receiver. I think the Browns are going to go with that second round draft pick where opportunity also meets stock, right? Where there's a lot of opportunity for a position and where there's a position that's deep and they can get a talented player that wouldn't otherwise be available at pick 55, I believe the Browns are at. And I think that's going to happen at offensive tackle. I think, you can get Kingsley Suamataia, Roger Rosengarten, I thought really had an excellent Senior Bowl. I think he's going to have a good combine. If he puts up some good numbers at the combine, he might become a second-round draft pick. You might be able to get him in the third. I think this is the year where you can sneak and get a good tackle in the later rounds, so you can keep Jed on the contract for this year, but start the process of being able to move on. Kind of like what they were hoping to do with Jack Conklin, but that timeline got accelerated because Jack Conklin, unfortunately, got injured. But that's what I think is going to happen with Jed Wills. I don't think the Browns extend him. It doesn't make very much sense for them to extend him. And you have to remember, starting in 2025, the Browns get their first-round picks back. Let's talk about Elijah Moore. The Browns invested a good amount in Elijah Moore when they tried to get him, right? They traded a second-round pick for him and what eventually ended up becoming Cedric Tillman. So they are invested in the success of Elijah Moore. And the thing I worry about is that he's a free agent in 2025, which means, let's say he does live up to expectations in 2020. And he gets over 1,000 yards or he gets about 1,000 yards, well, then the number for him goes up considerably for a player who you've seen have 1 year of production. I don't know if that's where the Browns want to go with. They've also been investing at the position with different guys, Cedric Tillman, David Bell. They'll probably draft another one. I don't know if Elijah Moore is going to be here past his rookie contract. It seems like to me that they would be comfortable with moving on, and that might be the reality of the Deshaun Watson contract. While I think people kind of, when they fearmonger about the salary cap, right? Or not fearmonger, but when people go into full panic mode about the NFL salary cap, they tend to only bring up the big names, right? The big names. Oh, you're not going to be able to keep him and this and that player and that player. And it's not the big names you lose because you have a big contract. It's those mid-range names that you have to drop, right? Like that's who usually becomes the victim of a big contract, is those mid-range players, right? Your Sione Takitakis of the world, your Greg Newsoms, right? The guys who are good players, but not star players. You always have money in the budget for star players. You always have money in the budget for cheap players. But those mid-range players that might get a decent deal, right? Those guys are harder to keep around when you have a quarterback because that's the guys that you lose. And Elijah Moore, I think, will be decent next year. I think you just don't got money in the budget for decent, right? Like if he's a great wide receiver, you're willing to pay a great wide receiver and put him on a long-term deal. But Elijah Moore will probably be a 2-year deal guy, and it doesn't make sense for them to do it at a 2-year deal. So I think Elijah Moore probably going to become a free agent when his contract's up in a couple of years. The next guy I want to talk about, I just kind of brought him up, Greg Newsome. Greg Newsome is prime. I don't know what they're going to do with him, right? He might get his 5th-year option, right? We'll see what happens with that in the summer. And I think he will get his 5th-year option, but I think he's going to be in Jed Wills' territory because, unfortunately for him, Martin Emerson has come out of nowhere and been a better boundary corner than he's been. And that's not to say that Greg's a bad boundary corner. We see it whenever Denzel Ward goes out. He does a fine job holding up that boundary position. He's made some plays. He's a good corner. He could start for somebody at the boundary position like immediately. He wouldn't even have to try. But the Browns don't need him to really, like, they got Cam Mitchell who can take over for the slot corner stuff. And honestly, slot corner, you usually fill it with the 5th-round pick, not a 1st-round pick, right? He's kind of overqualified for the current role on the offense that he has, but there's really no room for advancement for him, right? Because he's not going to usurp Martin Emerson at this point. He's not going to usurp Denzel Ward, who's under contract till 2029. There's really nowhere for him to go, right? He's going to be this third corner. And that's what makes his fifth-year option interesting. Is not because he doesn't deserve it as a player. He's a good player. He would get a fifth-year option on a less loaded team. But with the team that's loaded, where he's playing slot corner, 19 million is what his fifth-year option is. Correct me if I'm wrong. Someone check on Over the Cap. But it's a lot of money for a slot corner. And that's really what his role has been relegated to be. Now, he doesn't do like exclusively slot. He's like a slot plus corner, right? He does some stuff on the boundary. He covers some guys. He's not your average slot corner, but again, that's not a job worth paying somebody 19. It's like this doesn't make sense for the budget. And I think that's the reality of Greg Newsome. A good player. He'll be a good player wherever else he goes. He's just fell in a situation where they drafted a better boundary corner in the third round by some miracle, and you got hurt, and now you playing slot and whatever it is. It's tough. It's tough for Greg, but that's kind of the situation that Greg finds himself in. And that's why I don't think he extension, because if it doesn't really make sense to give Greg a fifth-year option, which, I mean, it kind of does because you don't have the most confidence in Denzel Ward's ability to stay healthy. So it makes sense to have a high-level backup and a high-level slot corner. Like, that serves a purpose for this year. So I could see them being like, hey, we're going to play this for 2024 and 25. We'll give them the fifth-year option. We'll deal with the cap. We'll move stuff down the line. But once we start got to pay bills on this whole thing, that's a player we're going to lose, right? So they might decide that, and that would make sense. But I don't know, man. Like, just if we're looking at this from a spreadsheet perspective, it don't really make much sense for Greg Newsome to continue to stay on this team. Also, some other questions that I'm not really going to go on and answer right now because these are a little bit later down the line. There's Juan Thornhill is at an interesting point. Like, I think he really does need a good year this year. As much as I agree with some of his takes about the fan base, like sometimes some of the fan base is a bit too negative, all of that. He can't be saying that because now he becomes the target of all of that negativity. And the issue with that is he becomes the target of all that negativity. That negativity pisses him off, which makes him get mad about that negativity, which then makes more people who are like that he's talking about the negative people get madder at him. It is the Streisand effect. Look, there are angry fans for every team. There are fans who, don't have the best mentality. I think it's better to frame these questions, if I were Juan Thornhill, not as what's wrong with the Browns fan base, and just kind of frame it as what's wrong with some NFL fans. Because when you start implying that some fans are better than others, people are going to get real sensitive about that. And while I think he does make a good point, there are some Browns fans who don't necessarily say the most. They say stuff to players that I don't think helps them, right? Like, I think that that's a true statement. And I do believe that some of this toxicness that we see online, it gets to the players. They're human. They read their mentions like everybody else. And people who say, well, they shouldn't read it. They shouldn't care what somebody says about them. Imagine if your name was searchable on Google and you could search what people were saying. You would look that shit up, man. Like, I understand why people could be bothered by such a thing, is my whole point. And I get where he's coming from. But also, on the other hand, you kind of making it worse on yourself by making it so public. And if he doesn't have a good year next year, I don't think he going to want to be here. I don't think they going to want him here. It's going to be a whole thing. I just would rather, Thornhill play well, so we ain't got to deal with none of that. Another guy who is completely on the other side of the spectrum, Joe Bitonio. Hey, man, at some point he gonna have to retire, or he's going to be too old to resign. In a couple of years might be that point. He's already having back issues, and I really want to see how he bounces back this year because back issues on an older guard, terrifying. I wouldn't be surprised, to be honest with you, if the Browns drafted a guard. I wouldn't be surprised if this draft had multiple offensive linemen, multiple tight end, multiple running backs, maybe a wide receiver. Like, that's really where I'm at with the draft. Like, once we get in mock draft season, you'll see what I mean. But I think that the Browns are looking at guards. I think they're looking at tackles. I think they're looking at interior beef players. Think about this. The last time they revamped, when Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski first got here, the first thing they did was revamp the offensive line. That was the first remodel that they did of this team, right? And this team does a remodel of something every year, right? In 2020, it was the offensive line. In 2021, it was the defensive secondary. In 2022, it was the offense, just the skill players, right? They brought in Amari Cooper, Deshaun Watson. They brought in a bunch of skill players, right? Quarterback, all that. And in 2023, it was the defensive line that got a remodel. So now we're looking at this offensive line and they're like, man, it's been 4 years. They're due for a remodel. I think that's probably what's on the docket for them, right? I think they're thinking about moving some furniture around, getting some new pieces in, moving some old pieces out. And I wouldn't be surprised if a guard is on the list this year and a tackle's on the list and maybe another guard is on the list, right? Like they want to get cheaper and they want to get younger and they probably want to get a little bit more athletic at the offensive line with a new offensive line coach. So I wouldn't be surprised if the offensive line is where the Browns focus a lot of their attention in the draft, especially because this is a pretty decent offensive line class, in my opinion. So that's my thoughts about, who might not be back in the future for the Cleveland Browns. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.